So when someone's maybe challenging you on your view of the problem of evil, you want to be equipped to be able to answer them. You want to be in a place to be able to give them good, satisfying answers intellectually and emotionally. But you can also ask them, what do you believe about the problem? How do you solve the problem of evil and suffering? And ask them from their perspective how they approach it. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. Okay, well, last week we talked about the nature of humanness, what it meant to be human. Particularly, we talked about two primary things. We talked about the fact that we have souls, how we know we have a soul or a spirit, as opposed to the materialistic view that just says we're just physical bodies is all we are. And then we talked some about the difference between animals and humans, and how we know and why we know that humans are different than simple animals. So now we want to start to address the problem of evil, and this will be our last subject in our module in which we're dealing with philosophical questions. Okay, and we'll spend actually 3 weeks on the problem of evil. I have listed for you there a number of resources. There's several resources that are very readable, very accessible. There's Abdu Murray is a Muslim gentleman who converted to Christ. He's actually spoken here at Trinity. He's written a book called Grand Central Question, in which he deals with 3 or 4 major questions that every worldview has to address, and he talks about the problem of evil. And then there's the book To Everyone an Answer, and it has a chapter on the problem of evil. Geisler and Brooks' book, When Skeptics Ask, has a section on the problem of evil. Then there's a fairly advanced, actually this book by Alvin Plantinga is a leading Christian philosopher, one of the most influential Christian philosophers of our generation. I use that term, our generation, loosely here. This book, God, Freedom, and Evil, comes from some work he did back in the 70s, where he really broke some real new ground with philosophers in the area of problem of evil. So this is really kind of a seminal work on the whole question of problem and evil from a Christian perspective. But it is written, it's actually a small book, it's not all that long, but it's really, it is written at a somewhat higher level, so you have to kind of wade through it. It took me about 2 or 3 readings before I had it figured out, but it's tremendously helpful in understanding the problem of evil. Craig's book On Guard, written at the popular level, and Frank Turek's book on Stealing from God has a good section on the problem of evil. And then I actually just came across this website this week. A fellow by the name of Mike Winger has a vlog on Did God Create Evil? That's really helpful. Particularly, he talks about a passage we're going to talk about today in Isaiah. And then probably the most renowned writer on the list there is me, right? Okay. So there's a paper actually that I wrote, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago on the problem of evil, which is available on our class website. So you can go there, go to the resources page, and it's there, titled As Sparks Fly Upward. So those are just some various resources. Okay. So when we're talking about the problem of evil, most Christian apologists will readily acknowledge and tell you that the problem of evil and suffering is the primary problem that we face when we're talking to skeptics or non-Christians or people who struggle with issues of Christianity, the most common problem they will raise is the problem of evil and suffering. Okay? So it's clearly one we need to have an understanding of. But I mentioned this last week, it's not just Christianity that has to address this problem, right? Every worldview has to have some kind of solution, some kind of intellectually satisfying and emotionally satisfying answer to the problem of evil. So when someone's maybe challenging you on your view of the problem of evil, you want to be equipped to be able to answer them. You want to be in a place to be able to give them good, satisfying answers intellectually and emotionally. But you can also ask them, what do you believe about the problem? How do you solve the problem of evil and suffering? And ask them from their perspective how they approach it. Because oftentimes you'll see when they begin to share what the flaws are, and we'll look at some of those today. Okay. And then I just want to point out, and we'll get into this either next week or the following week, I don't remember which, but actually the problem of evil can be an argument for theism. It can be an argument for the Christian faith. So we'll see how that works later. But that doesn't change the fact that it is still an obstacle to people, and we need to be equipped to be able to help them answer it. So there are, when you think about it, really there are kind of two general kinds of evil that we think of. So typically when you talk about evil, people will think of, first of all, they may think of moral evil. So this is where people do things that are wrong, morally wrong, okay? And maybe it's something they do to somebody else or something they fail to do for somebody. But it's a moral issue. So there's moral evil, and then there's what we would think of as natural evil. And people struggle with both of these, of course. So natural evil would be things like disasters and earthquakes and disease. You know, many people, you know, today, you know, in the world, you know, that we live in this year, people, you know, struggle with the question, why this virus, you know? Not just scientifically why, but at a more deeper philosophical level, why does God allow this kind of suffering to go on? Why do these things happen? So there are two kinds of evil. And there are actually two distinct problems regarding evil. And the first is what we might think of as the intellectual problem, or what's called the logical problem of evil. So this has to do with, as you'll see a little bit later, this has to do with the question is, how can a good God exist? How can there be a good God when you have a world with all this kind of evil and suffering in it? So that's the logical problem. But then there's also what I like to call the experiential problem. Some people call it the emotional problem. And I like to steer away from that to some degree, because you don't want to give the impression that it's, quote, only an emotional problem, because it's a very profound experience. So when I'm talking about the experiential problem, I'm talking about the problem that people have, whatever their intellectual answer is to evil, when they're actually experiencing evil at a very intense level, or somebody very close to them is experiencing some kind of evil, whether it's a moral evil or a natural evil that they're experiencing. Maybe it's some terrible wrong that somebody you love has experienced. They've been wronged in some terrible way, or maybe it's some disease that you have, or someone you really love has. This brings in the experience, what I call the experiential problem, and whatever my intellectual answers are to the problem of evil, sometimes, even though I know intellectually one thing, I'm experiencing something else inside of me that really makes it difficult. And the experiential problem, and well, the logical problem too, are problems not just for non-Christians. It's not just non-Christians. It's not just atheists or unbelievers or Muslims or other people who struggle with the problem of evil. Christians struggle with the problem of evil. And maybe you've gone through it yourself, or maybe you know some Christians who have gone through terrible suffering, and you've heard them say things like, well, how can God let this happen? Or why does God let this happen to me? Or that sort of thing. So these are problems that are faced not just by non-Christians, but we as Christians have to deal with them too. But because we have these two different kinds of problems, these the logical problem and the experiential problem, we need to learn how to be able to address each one of them. Because the kind of apologetic we give for the intellectual problem is an entirely different kind of apologetic than we give for the experiential problem. So next week we'll be dealing with the logical problem and how do we answer the intellectual aspect. How do we answer the intellectual questions that people have. And then the following week we're going to spend a lot of time just talking about, okay, when people are actually going through suffering themselves, how do we help them? How do we help them work through the experience? Because they really are two entirely different approaches. And if we miss the boat on detecting where they are and how we should be answering them, we're not going to be effective. So here's the big question. What is evil? Anybody want to venture an explanation to me or a definition of what is evil?
The absence of good.
He says the absence of good. Anybody else? Pardon?
I second that motion.
You second that motion. Okay, we've got a very advanced class here. Okay, we can skip the whole first part of this lesson. Now, actually, this whole idea of how do we define evil really is typically for most people very hard to define. Okay, and so oftentimes when people think about evil, they'll go, well, I don't know exactly what it is, I just know it when I see it, And that reminds me of a Supreme Court case back in I think it was 1964, okay, and so probably most of you can't remember this, but I actually remember when this case came down. But it was actually not abortion case, it was a pornography case before the Supreme Court. And as they were wrestling with this particular case, a pornography case, the Supreme Court came out with a particular decision, and Justice Potter Stewart wrote a consenting opinion, and in his consenting opinion, he said, I don't know how to define what pornography is, he said, but he said, I know it when I see it, and this isn't it, meaning the particular case that they were talking about in the Supreme Court case, okay? And oftentimes that's people's approach to evil, is just, I know it when I see it, right? Well, that works kind of on the everyday level, but when people are really struggling with the problem of evil, we've got to have a better understanding of exactly what evil is, okay? So we need to move beyond that level. So again, we talked about how different worldviews address the question. So when you think about atheism, of course, atheism says there is no God, and so all of reality is just made up of the material, natural world, right? So logically then speaking, under atheism, there really is no such thing as evil, right? It's just the way the world is, right? It's just the laws of nature operate and things happen, and so earthquakes happen and hurricanes happen and that sort of thing. It's just the way the world is. But even people who do evil things are just doing evil things because that's the way the laws of physics and chemistry are working in their body that are causing them. So that's really the logical answer from an atheistic point of view. But of course the problem is nobody can live that way, or very few people can live that way. And so most atheists are not satisfied with that answer. And so typically then atheists will avoid that conclusion by just making an outright claim that there is such a thing as evil. So they're not able to particularly identify it or define it according to their philosophy, but they just know it exists, and so they'll claim that in fact it does exist. But the problem is they're then claiming that things are evil without having any kind of a transcendent or objective source by which they measure what is evil, right? So under atheism then, or under materialism or naturalism, our concept of evil then is completely human-based. In other words, it's just relative. It's what we as individuals just decide it is, all right? So So this is actually one of the reasons we have the problem here in America that we have today. The whole woke culture, the whole cancel culture, all of that thing, all those sorts of things are rooted in this kind of relativistic morality, this relativistic view of evil, that evil is what I say it is. So things that we thought were evil 50 years ago are no longer evil. Why? Not because some objective transcendent source changed his mind, but because we as people, as a society, as a culture have changed our mind, and so now we no longer think that's evil. But things that we didn't think were evil 50 years ago are now evil, okay? And if you do those things, or you say those things, or you think those things, then you get canceled or whatever, right? So this is the problem that we have with an atheistic or a strictly materialistic answer to evil. And then there's the dualist answer. Now, got to avoid some confusion, because last week we were talking about dualism in a positive sense, right? But last week we were talking about something different. And I warned you, when I brought up the topic of dualism last week, I said, next week we're going to talk about a different kind of dualism. So dualism, as I said last week, is used in different ways when you're talking about different things. So the kind of dualism we're talking about today is a different kind of dualism than what we were talking about last week. Last week we were talking about the belief that humans are both body and spirit, okay? And so that's what we meant by dualism. Today we're using the word dualist in an entirely different way. And the idea of dualism, when we're talking about evil and good, is the idea that within the realm of reality there are two forces. There's a good force and there's an evil force. Or there's a good God or there's an evil God. And so you just kind of have these two forces. They're roughly kind of compatible, or I mean not compatible, but equal to one another in kind of their status and their power. And they're at conflict, and then you kind of have to choose which force you want. Now culturally, what's the classic example of this belief of dualism in the popular culture? Star Wars, exactly, right. So as much as I love Star Wars, it's a completely pagan philosophy as far as the idea of good and evil. Because in Star Wars, right, you have the dark side, you know, and I don't know if they ever refer to Luke and is it Layla, or his sister, and Yoda. Yeah, I don't know if they ever refer to their side as the light side, but that's the idea you get. You get these two forces, right? And Luke has to decide which force he's going to align himself with, the dark side or the good side. And so then the idea is that evil emanates from this kind of evil God or this evil force, whatever it is. And depending on the dualist, they may view it differently. But here again, the problem is we don't have any objective, transcendent way to know which one's good or which one's evil. So, for example, if you take the Star Wars story, what's interesting is from the very beginning of the Star Wars story, you find yourself identifying and sympathizing with who? With Luke, with the light side, right? And you want them to win over the dark side. The question is why? Well, partly the reason why is because we have an innate sense of what's good and what's evil, right? But as far as the story is concerned, the only reason we side with Luke and Yoda and all those guys, you know, the only reason we side with them is because the story is written with them as the protagonists. The story is written in order for us to sympathize with and identify with them. But we have no objective measure why we shouldn't decide to side with the guys on the dark side, you know? And so this is the problem that you have with dualism. How do you determine which is the good and which is the evil, and why would you choose one over the other? So all that being said, I love the Star Wars. Well, the first three, I don't bother with any of the rest of them. But at any rate, I love the Star Wars stories, but we need to be aware of what is the philosophy that's being represented there. Okay, the Pantheist, on the other hand, and of course, you know, there are millions, if not billions, of people in the world who view evil this way. Evil and suffering are merely an illusion, right? So your objective, your goal, is to reach that enlightened state, whether you call it nirvana or whatever you call it, to reach that enlightened state where you realize that all is one, and so there is no such thing as evil, right? So evil is just an illusion, and you will no longer, once you're enlightened, you will no longer suffer. So your body may be racked with cancer, your family may have just been wiped out by a tsunami or whatever, but you don't feel any negative vibes from that because you are now one with the cosmos. But of course the problem with this is for the vast majority of people who haven't achieved that so-called enlightenment, it's just, it really is a very kind of hopeless state. And also one of the problems, and we actually see this in some regions of the world, it's a disincentive to address evil. So in parts of the world where there's a very pronounced pantheistic belief about evil, there's a real tendency not to address or try to resolve problems of evil and suffering, because what people really need is not to have their wounds healed or their emotions healed. What they really need is they just need to get enlightened. And so the stress is on enlightenment rather than seeking to really address the problems. And that's why we have, for example, not so much today, but certainly in the past, for example, in India, some of the conditions that were allowed to persist in areas of India was because of this philosophy. And the other problem, of course, with it is if evil is an illusion, then so is good. Okay? There is no evil or good, right? So those are some of those problems with other worldviews, approaches to the problem of evil. But the question is then, well, how can we address it? How can we address it in both an intellectually and an emotionally satisfying way? And it's really important as we start out in defining evil that we get it right. Because if we don't get it right, it really sets us up to not be successful in sharing the faith with people, right? And talking to people about the Christian faith. Because a faulty definition of evil leads to an erroneous concept of God. So here's an example of how this might work. So somebody says, God is the creator of everything. Evil is something. Therefore, God created evil. So very simple, logical, deductive syllogism here. Two premises and a conclusion. God is the creator of everything. Evil is something. Therefore, God created evil. And the question is, so if somebody presented that to you as challenging your Christian faith and they give you this, basically this argument, how would you answer that? What's wrong with that argument? Okay? And I would suggest to you that the problem with this argument lies in a definition. So let's pursue that a little bit. First of all, from a Christian perspective, from a theist perspective, what are some things that evil isn't? Thinking about the worldviews we've just talked about. One, as Christians, we don't believe that evil is an illusion. We believe that evil is very real. Okay? So it's not just an illusion we can just think away. It is, in fact, a very real thing. And this is much more satisfying to people than the idea that evil is an illusion. Because when somebody is suffering, you can say to them, I know you're suffering, and your suffering is real, and there's a reason why you're suffering. We can tell people that, and that's very satisfying to them. It's not the end of the answer, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. Then secondly, of course, we don't believe that evil is kind of some force or some, a good God and a bad God. This means, incidentally, that we don't believe that God is the good God and the devil is the bad God. Okay? The devil is, Satan is a created object just like we are. So he's not some kind of evil force from which all evil emanates. If evil does not emanate out of the devil, he is clearly an evil person, he's an evil demon, but he is not evil in that sense of good and evil that the dualist would argue for. And then secondly, evil isn't something. Okay? Evil is not a thing out there. It's not an object out there. It's not, as Mike Winger I talked about earlier, it's not some kind of stuff that just kind of globs onto you, right? So evil is not some kind of super mutated virus that infects us and infects our brains and somehow contaminates us, and then we do evil things, all right? So evil is not a thing. Or it's not an object. It's not some kind of stuff. All right. So what do we believe that evil is? And of course, my brilliant class participants here pointed out correctly that that evil is, in historic theistic Christian view, evil is the absence of good, or actually, it's a little bit better to say evil is the privation of good. So what we mean by that is that that you have a situation where there ought to be good and it's not there. Okay? So, for example, we could talk about blindness. So there are certain living organisms who were designed and created to have sight, right? Not all living organisms have sight or are designed to have sight, so in their case the lack of sight is not a bad thing, it's not an evil thing. But when we see a person who doesn't have vision, then we think, well, that's not good, you know, that's bad, because they were really designed to have sight and their lives are to function with sight. Now I don't feel that way when I see a bat, you know, because bats weren't designed to have sight, they've got something else, right? So what we have is we have evil here because there's the absence of something good that ought to be there, right? At the moral level, James says, to know the right thing to do and not do it is sin. Okay? So here's a case where someone knows there's a right thing to do, there is a right thing to do, and they don't do it. We call it the sin of omission. They don't do it. So what we have here is we have the absence of good, and that, James tells us, is sin or evil. Or there's another way, it actually kind of folds into this part of the definition, but another way to look at it is that otherwise good things are in some kind of an improper relationship with one another. So you have things that are in themselves inherently good, but somehow they're not functioning correctly together the way they were designed or the way they were created to. Okay? So if you get too much water in the human lung, well, water's a good thing, we like water, okay? And the human lung, we kind of like those too, they're kind of useful, right? They're two good things, but when you fill the lung with water, that's not a good thing, right? So you have two good things that are in some kind of an improper relationship. And at the moral level, adultery would be an example. So you have two people, they're created by God, they are inherently, there's something good about them, okay, but they're in a relationship, and a relationship in the right situation would be a good relationship, but they're in a relationship, they relate to one another in a way that wasn't designed and intended by God, and that's evil, okay? So we can have good and evil, or we can have evil both at the natural level and at the moral level. We can have evil whenever we have a situation in which there should be good and it's somehow deprived or absent, or where good things are in an improper relationship. Now when you think about that, each aspect of both aspects of this definition that I've just given you is what Alvin Plantinga calls in his groundbreaking book on the problem of evil, what he refers to as a state of affairs. Okay, so it's not a thing, it's not stuff. What it is what's called a state of affairs. So, what is a state of affairs? Well, we have a state of affairs right here. Okay. The state of affairs we have right here is we're having an apologetics class. And the group of us, we've come together, we're meeting together, and I'm standing up here talking, and you are hopefully listening, and we have chairs, and we're arranged, and the temperature's such and such in the room, and we have walls located in such. This whole situation here is a state of affairs. It's just simply the way things are, okay? And that's how Albert von Plantinga, this great, brilliant philosopher, defines the state of affair, is it's just simply the way things are. So you can have all kinds of states of affairs. You can have the state of affairs of you being tall, you know, or you could have the state of affairs of a OU football game, okay? So they're just the way things are, the way things they're happening at a particular point, all right? So, so evil then, when we think about the definition I just gave you a moment ago, evil then is not a thing, it's not some kind of object, it's not an infection, okay? It's a state of affairs. It's the state of affairs where good ought to be and it's not there, or where good things are in some kind of improper relationship with each other. They are a state of affairs. And this definition of evil as a state of affairs becomes crucial in how we answer certain questions about the problem of evil, like, did God create evil? Okay? So, of course, that's one of the problems that people wrestle with. Even Christians wrestle with this problem, is we know that God's the creator and the whole world, you know, the whole cosmos came into existence by God's creation, and there's evil in the world, so did God create evil? Okay. And this is a question that people often wrestle with. So think about our syllogism that we looked at a few minutes ago. God is the creator of all things. Evil is a thing. Therefore, God created evil. So that's the whole idea of this syllogism. But what's now, from what we've talked about so far, what's wrong with that syllogism? Where does it break down? Okay, so premise number 2 is false, right? So the conclusion then does not follow from the premises, because one of the premises is false. Because we now know that evil is not a thing in the sense that we talk about when we talk about God creating things. So let's explore that a little bit more. Excuse me. So what if somebody reworked the syllogism? So I go, well, okay, you're arguing about words here, right? So I'm going to rework my syllogism, and we'll put it this way. God created all reality. Evil is a real state of affairs, therefore God created evil. Okay? So now with this syllogism, it looks like the person has avoided the pitfall of the last syllogism because they've changed the definition of evil, okay, and they're accepting our definition of a state of affairs, but they're saying, wait a minute, but didn't God create all reality? And evil is a real state of affairs, therefore God created evil. What's wrong with this syllogism?
God didn't create all reality?
God did not create all reality. Yeah, I know this may come as a shock to you, but in fact, we all know that God didn't create all reality. What is one reality we know God didn't create? Himself. Yeah, that's right. God is real, and He didn't create Himself. Okay? So right off the bat, we know that premise 1 fails as it's stated. Because we know for sure that there's at least one reality that God didn't create. He didn't create Himself. So then actually we know there's some states of affairs that God didn't create. Well, don't let me get ahead of myself. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So the conclusion, therefore, is not supported. All right. So now what we need to think about is the difference between creating something and actualizing something. So typically, when we think about creation, we're thinking about material things, right? And nature. And so like the forces of nature and atoms and molecules and trees and rocks and people and that sort of thing. So we're thinking about things. And so when we're thinking about God creating, we're thinking about the things that God created, right? And He either creates them as it says there in the notes, he either created them ex nihilo, out of nothing, okay? So some things God brought into existence out of nothing, and some other things God brought into existence, or he made using the things that he had earlier made. So he created man, he says, from the dust of the ground, right? So God either creates things ex nihilo, or he creates things out of pre-existing matter, right? But that's what we mean when we talk about God creating. And that's what we as Christians mean when we talk about God's creation, even if he's creating spirits like angels and things like that. But it's not really correct to talk about a state of affairs as being created. That's not proper, okay? Because states of affairs aren't created in the same way. They're not the same kind of thing, right? They're different. They're, in one sense, they're kind of an abstract rather than being like a material object, okay? So when philosophers talk then about states of affairs, they don't talk about them being created, because that's very misleading. They talk about them being actualized. So we can actualize a state of affairs as opposed to creating them, and that helps keep in our mind the distinction between material things that come into existence and states of affairs that begin or come into existence in some way, okay? And here's the important thing, is we can establish that God does not actualize all states of affairs, okay? So again, what would be a state of affair that we know God did not actualize? It's actually the same answer we had a minute ago. God did not actualize the state of affair of his existence. So we have the state of affairs of God existing, right? God didn't actualize that. He's always existed, right? So God did not actualize that. So you can have states of affairs. Nor did God actualize the state of affairs of his being loving, or of his being just, okay? He didn't actualize those. Those are states of affairs that exist, that are real, but they're not something that God actualized. So we know that God didn't actualize all states of affairs. We just haven't resolved the question about evil yet, okay? So we know that God did not actualize the state of affair of his existing. And think about another example, okay? So this will play with your imagination here. So Adam and Eve before the fall. They're in this beautiful, luscious garden, okay? And it's before the fall. And they're just enjoying life, and we have no idea how long Adam and Eve lived before the fall. You know, we read in Genesis and we think it happened on the next day or whatever, but, you know, they could have actually lived for many, many, many years before the fall. We don't know, right? But, so at any rate, they're living there in the garden, and so one morning Eve says to Adam, let's go on a picnic this afternoon, okay? So they're going to go on a picnic. So Adam goes out and he collects some weeds and he weaves a basket, because you got to have a picnic basket, right? And so he weaves a basket, and so then Eve, you know, she gets some, I don't know what she gets, but at any rate, they put it in the basket and they go walking down to the river, and they sit on the riverbank under the pomegranate tree with their feet in the water having a picnic. We have a state of affairs where Adam and Eve are having a picnic on the river under the pomegranate tree, right? And yet that's not a state of affairs that we would say God created. Now certainly he created the world that made that possible, all right? But he didn't actualize that state of affairs. Adam and Eve actualized that state of affairs, assuming, of course, that you're not a, you know, just dyed-in-the-wool, full-fledged determinist, all right? So we say then that Adam and Eve are what's called the efficient cause. There are different kinds of causes, and Adam and Eve in that case would have been the efficient cause of this state of affairs. They actualized this state of affairs of their picnic there on the river. So according to Scripture then, as we understand Scripture, and our Christian position is, God did not actualize the state of affairs of human moral evil. Adam and Eve actualized the state of affairs of human moral evil. So no, God did not create evil, and God did not actualize the state of affairs of human moral evil. Adam and Eve actualized that state of affairs. Well, that's all well and good, until the person you're talking to pulls out their King James Bible and brings you to Isaiah 45:7, where it says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. Okay? And he says, I, the Lord, do all these things. Okay? And they show you that verse and you can go, whew, so much for all that stuff I learned in apologetics class. The Bible says God created evil. Well, does it really? In fact, of course, skeptics do like to cite this verse, but you'll notice they always cite it from the King James Version, and there's a reason for that, okay? And that is because the word that's translated evil in the King James Version, all right, is the Hebrew word ra. And it turns out that that word has a broad, what we call semantic range. There are a number of different ways that that word can be translated. In other words, it means a number of different things depending on the context in which it's being used. All right? So it actually can refer to, and does refer to in a number of places, moral evil. But it can also refer to things like disaster or calamity, or misery or injury or harm or ruin or misfortune. And it's translated a number of different ways in the Bible, in different verses, and I've listed just a handful of verses there for you where that same word ra is translated different ways. And the important thing to keep in mind is that in the context in Isaiah 45, he's actually contrasting ra with shalom. Okay, so he says, I create peace and I create evil. Okay, the word peace there is the Hebrew word shalom, which has the idea of goodness and bountifulness and peace and that sort of thing. Okay, so we know that in the context, the word ra is being used in some sense that is the opposite of peace. Well, we don't normally think of moral evil and peace as being opposite of one another, okay? They're just, we don't normally think that way, but rather the opposite of peace would be war, right? Or disruption or chaos or things like that, right? So that's the most likely way that the word ra should be translated, is some sense that gives the idea of something that's the opposite of peace, and in fact that's the way all modern translations translate it. So if you look in your modern translation, whether the ESV or the New American Standard or the NIV or whatever, probably in most, I don't know, there may be one or two modern translations that don't, but most of them will use a word other than evil here, because in the context it has that idea of calamity or disorder or chaos, all right? And as it turns out, in fact, even when the King James translators translated, they didn't make a mistake, okay? Because when the King James was translated in the early 17th century or 17th century, when it was translated, the English word evil had a broader semantic range in common usage than it does today. So when we think of evil today, oftentimes what comes to our mind is moral evil. That's how we normally think of it, okay? But in the times that the King James translation was translated, when the word evil was used, people had to figure out from the context, what are you talking about? Are you talking about moral evil? Are you talking about calamity? Are you talking about destruction? What are you talking about? So it isn't like the King James translators made a mistake here. It's that they were translating the English in the context of the historical culture for which they were translating. So if we translate it as calamity or destruction or something like that, then we don't have a problem, because we know from Scripture that God does in fact oftentimes bring about calamity. He does bring about destruction. So I just listed a few examples for you there. The flood, okay? The flood is a case of God bringing about a calamity for a greater good. He had a greater good in mind, right? And so He brought about the flood, or the plagues in Egypt, a terrible, calamitous experience for, of course, the Egyptians. Israel's defeat and being carried away into captivity and slavery into Babylon, okay? So that's a calamity, it's a destructive event. Jerusalem is destroyed. And these are things that God brings about, okay? But they are not moral evil, right? They are calamity. There's, of course, moral evil going on in the situation, but they are not inherently moral evil. So we really don't have a problem with Isaiah 45 when we understand what it's actually saying. So So where are we then? Thinking about what we've thought about today before we go forward into next week's lesson. We've argued that evil is not an illusion, that it's very real. We've argued that evil is not an object or a thing or a force in that sense. We've argued that things are created, but since evil is not a thing, to use the word created regarding evil is confusing and misleading. So we want to stay away from that word. We've argued that an evil state of affairs, that evil is a state of affairs, and that God did not and does not actualize all states of affairs. He certainly actualizes many, but certainly not all. And we believe that Adam and Eve are the ones who actualize the state of affair of human moral evil. Okay? So it is incorrect to argue that God actualized the state of affairs of evil. So we deny that God created created evil, and we deny that God actualized the state of affairs of human moral evil. All right? But we still have big problems to solve, right? We're not out of the woods yet, so to speak. So the skeptic or the unbeliever could still argue, well, but wait a minute. Evil would not exist if God hadn't created the world. So isn't God somehow still responsible for evil since He created the world? And on the other hand, they can argue, well, wait a minute, you say that God is omnipotent, He's all-powerful, you say He's omniscient, He knows all, and that God is perfectly good. But how can you have an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God in a world in which evil exists, especially moral evil? How can you believe that God exists? So, since evil exists, we know that an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God doesn't exist. Okay? So these are the arguments. With everything we said today, these are the arguments that can still be made, which ultimately, of course, either puts the blame for evil on God, or it just simply denies the possibility of God's existence. And this is what we call the logical problem of evil. So there are actually two kind of versions of the logical problem of evil. One would be the stronger version, which argues that it's the deductive version. Remember, in a deductive argument, the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. And so in the deductive version, the argument is God cannot exist. God does not exist because of the existence of evil. That's the logical, or the deductive version of the logical problem. And then there's the inductive version, which is not as strong. It just simply says, given the existence of evil, God probably doesn't exist. So one says God doesn't exist, the other said God probably doesn't exist. So those are the logical problem of evil, and those are the things we're going to talk about next week. Those are the questions we're going to try to resolve next week. So, any questions, comments? Okay? See you guys next week.